Good evening. Hello. Hi. As folks continue to take their seats, I'm going to introduce our event quickly. Do not worry, have no fear. My name is Judah Bernstein. I'm the Academic Programs Coordinator here. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Center for Jewish History. The Center for Jewish History is an umbrella institution that houses our 5 wonderful partner organizations whose emblems you can find in the Great Hall on the walls. They are American Jewish Historical Society, American Sephardi Federation, Leo Baeck Institute, Yeshiva University Museum, and the YIVO Institute of Jewish Research. Together, these partners possess an extraordinary trove of Jewish historical artifacts, documents, and other media that constitute the largest repository of Jewish archival material outside of Israel and perhaps in the world. The archival library and collections housed at the center span over 1,000 years. They constitute more than 5 miles of archival boxes, which in archival speak is a lot of boxes. Over 500,000 volumes of printed material, some 100 million documents in dozens of languages from manifold geographic locations. That is to say that right here in this unassuming building on a sleepy, quiet street in Chelsea, Manhattan, any member of the public can walk through the doors, enter our Lillian Goldman reading room on the 3rd floor, and immerse themselves in the personal, regional, national, and transnational histories of Jews across countries and time periods. I happened to exercise that very privilege myself the other day in assembling this PowerPoint, which is drawn from archival materials that can be found at our friends at the American Jewish Historical Society, and which reflect the ebb and flow of anti-Jewish hostility in the United States. Although Jews in America have faced historically low degrees of anti-Semitism, the image above, a cartoon from an 1877 publication at American Jewish Historical Society, attests that anti-Jewish hostility became a matter of pressing concern in the late 19th century. The cartoon came on the heels of the scandalous refusal of entry to a prominent Jewish businessman, Joseph Seligman, at a well-to-do New York hotel, the Grand Union in Saratoga, in 1877. Such hostility, of course, intensified leading up to and following World War I, perhaps most notoriously symbolized by Henry Ford's publication of a serialized screed about Jewish global conspiracies, The International Jew, originals of which you can also find upstairs in multiple languages and editions. Jews in America did not stand idly by in the face of this attack, though. Some, like the Yiddish writer, whose book is above, lampooned Ford as a puppet of the Ku Klux Klan. Others lambasted their enemies as hateful anti-Semites. Indeed, the radio priest and nativist Charles Coughlin, in this letter, you can see his signature below, also in our archive, he complains, and I quote, "I do not relish being characterized as an anti-Semite and a pro-Nazi," unfortunately. He went on to accuse his attackers of attacking a priest and therefore of the Christian religion. It is these very same dynamics, rising anti-Semitic sentiment and their pushback against it by brave and courageous individuals, that we will be exploring this evening. The Center is a world-class archive, a portal for advanced research in Jewish history, but it is also a public institution, a Jewish Library of Congress. We see it as our mission to preserve the Jewish past so as to bring history alive to a public that craves to understand the contemporary by first turning to the historical. It is with this goal in mind that we planned the History Matters series, which we are inaugurating this evening. Funded generously by Dina and Jonathan Leader, the History Matters series will explore matters of contemporary relevance by hearing eminent historians reflect on the link between their historical research and the present. You can find a full listing of upcoming History Matters evenings on the back of your program. Our next event, which should be of extreme relevance considering politics in Poland at this very moment, will feature the distinguished scholar of Polish Jewish history, Jan Gross, who himself has been the subject of threats of arrest in Poland because of his work, and he will talk about it in February. Please attend. There are few historians more well-suited than Professor Deborah Lipstadt to inaugurate our series, beginning as we are with anti-Semitism in the past and the present. Professor Lipstadt is the Dorot Professor of Holocaust Studies at Emory University, where she has taught for decades. She is the author of multiple books on the Holocaust, including Beyond Belief, which explores how American newspapers covered and obscured the Holocaust, and Denying the Holocaust, a trenchant examination of Holocaust denial. It was that book, of course, that aroused the ire of leading Holocaust revisionist David Irving, who sued Lipstadt for libel in a court in the United Kingdom, a case which Lipstadt eventually won, and of course became the focus of a feature-length film, Denial, in which she is portrayed by Rachel Weisz. Professor Lipstadt brings to the center a profound expertise in the Holocaust, but also an undying effort, She brings a profound expertise in the Holocaust, but she is also an expert in the undying efforts by some to obscure, distort, or altogether deny that seminal event's historicity. She is thus well-placed to meditate on the linkages between past and present anti-Semitism, and we are grateful and thrilled to welcome her here. Professor Lipstadt will be interviewed this evening by Professor David Myers, CEO and President of the Center for Jewish History. Without further ado, I would like to call them to the stage. Thank you.
Welcome, Deborah.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I want to come back to hear Jan Gross. Come here, Jan Gross.
February 20th. We look forward to seeing you back for that. It's really a delight to have you as the inaugural speaker in our History Matters series. Who better to link the past and present than you? The structure of our conversation, I think, is going to follow this outline. First, we'll talk a little bit about Professor Lipstadt's background. Then we'll talk about her work, historical work, and try and trace the arc of that important body of historical research. And then finally, we'll make our way to the present, probably interjecting along the way observations about the present.
One thing, you can call me Deborah. Half of this audience I either went to shul with, to camp with, to school with, have written about, have attacked, they've attacked me, and they all know me as Deborah. So.
Okay, good, as do I. So, all right, Professor Lipstadt, let's begin. Not that your accent would betray any indication of where you come from, but maybe tell us a little bit about the world in which you grew up.
My father was an immigrant from Germany. He came in 26 as a young man. Both his parents had died. He couldn't find a job in Germany. The economy was terrible, so he came. And he was with actually a group, lived on the Upper West Side, of German Jewish emigres, Max Stern, many others, who came from Germany, young, modern, Orthodox men, and some women, because it was mainly men who went off on their own. A young woman didn't do that as much. And he was very involved in Upper West Side Jewish life, met my mother in shul. And he had the Haftarah and someone introduced him outside, and the minute Shabbos was over, he called. And there's a great anecdote. I have to tell you this wonderful anecdote. My mother was from Canada and moved to Detroit and then to New York. And she ran what was called Junior Mizrahi. And she had just organized a major conference and a major event, and she decided she'd give herself a couple of days vacation in Lakewood, which was then a center of Jewish, kosher hotels. And my father said, I'll drive you there. So he drove her there, and they're having tea before he was going to drive back to the city. And he was sitting there making a list. What are you working on? What are you writing? He said, well, I get invited, single man, I get invited for Shabbat, for Friday night, for lunch all the time. And it's hard for me to get to people's homes before Shabbat to bring them flowers. And so what I do twice a year, Rosh Hashanah, this was November, Rosh Hashanah and Pesach, I fill up my car with beautiful, beautiful, really gorgeous bouquets, and I go to all the homes of the people who have hosted me, and I give them as a Rosh Hashanah and a Pesach gift. She said, it's November, he said, I'm making my Pesach list. So she said, her name was Pyman. She said, is Pyman on the list? And he looked up, he said, if Pyman isn't Lipstadt by Pesach, she's not getting flowers. So, yeah. So it was
That is a yekka who starts in November to plan for Pesach.
very much a Yekisha household, but it was considered a mixed marriage because she was from Polish background, Lodz and Krakow.
And then you moved to Far Rockaway.
We moved to Far Rockaway, where actually we moved because my parents wanted to move out of the city, and it's a small apartment, same story as today. And they spent the summer in Far Rockaway, and they fell in love with Sharei Tefillah with Emanuel Rackman of blessed memory. And my father said, that's the kind of shul I want to raise my kids in. And very much of that, he came from the Samson Raphael Hirsch community, so very much of the sense of a rabbi who was a role model for your children. And so I would say that after my parents, Rabbi Rackman was the seminal influence, the critical influence on me. He, in '56, during a brief era of what we might call perestroika, when shortly after Khrushchev had come in, a group of rabbis went to the Soviet Union, and he went. I was then, 7, 8, and my father said to me, stay in for the sermon, it's going to be memorable. I didn't know what memorable was, but I stayed, and I remember him talking about that, and he was a great orator, and he was a learned rabbi, a learned man, but also a lawyer, a colonel in the Air Force. So it was very much of that, Torah and Mada approach. And it really had a major impact on me. And I write about it in History on Trial, in the book on the trial. But, and then we returned to New York City and moved into the Belle Nord. There must be someone here with a connection to the Belle Nord, on 86th and Broadway, to be close to the Jewish Center. Because again, my parents were looking for a shul with rabbinic figures, Rabbi Leo Young of blessed memory and Rabbi Norman Lamb, who were both steeped in Jewish learning, but steeped in secular
What would you say
learning.
the Jewish values that were most deeply impressed upon you were through your family and these great rabbinic figures?
A great sense of the wisdom of our tradition, that there was a wisdom that much of the world had taken and adopted and adapted, and also a sense of justice. There was a great sense. I remember one year my mother woke me up, and on a Sunday morning she said, it was early in the civil rights movement, and she said, there's a march in Harlem today, let's go. And my father was in the monument business, he made the monument for Andy Goodman. And how moved he was by that, and how he told us about it. And they got Chaim Gross, the sculptor, to design it. It's here in Queens. You can go see it on the way to LaGuardia, but how important that was, and how proud he was of that effort. So it was very much that sense of tzedek terdov, justice, and doing the right thing. And when I would get kicked out of class for standing up for a friend who was wrongly, I remember once a teacher was berating a student, and I said, she didn't do it. It was someone else. I didn't say who else. And I got kicked out. My mother said, congratulations.
So your tenacity, for which you are known, was born relatively early on. It's fair
bullheaded. Some would call it bullheadedness. Right, let's call it tenacity.
What about history? What historical events left a deep imprint on you? And maybe what historical events related to the annals of the Jews? What are your first memories of Jewish history?
That's very interesting. Certainly the Eichmann trial. I remember dinner was sort of, you would get on, I think it was ABC, would have the news then was 15 minutes, and they would have 15 minutes of the highlights of the Eichmann trial. Actually, it was the day before, because it was before transmission. They would tape the trial, film the trial. The films would be immediately brought down to Lud, then the airport, and then sent to London. A copy would stay in London, a copy would go to Germany, I believe, and then to New York. And we'd watch them as a family. We talked about it. The Shoah was not discussed that much, but I do remember, very strikingly, every Pesach at the Seder, my father would read, we got a little pamphlet that this was the night of the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and when it came time to open the door for Eliyahu and Shvol Chamatcha, pour out your wrath, my favorite part of the Seder.
It's a select group.
Yeah, right, of one, right? My father, we would stand, and my father would read that pamphlet, and he would weep. 2 times a year I would see him weep. That, and when he did the special Birchat Habanim, the blessing for the children on Erev Yom Kippur, there's a special Birchat Habanim. So that impressed me. We didn't talk about the Shoah, but you just somehow knew about it. You knew it had happened, and of course many of their friends on the Upper West Side were German Jewish refugees. And the doctor we went to had been a pediatrician in Germany, and when he came to this country, he had to work as an orderly till he could get his medical papers in order and things like that. So that certainly had an impact. I remember certainly the Eichmann trial, Exodus, the book and the movie. There were always Jewish books in our house. Singer, Meyer Levin. We got Commentary, New Republic, which I thought was a Jewish magazine. I don't know. It was, but a little less so at that time.
And so when did the desire to be a Jewish historian take rise in you?
You were
an undergraduate at City College.
City College,
and then you went to
but my
Brandeis.
2 years in Israel.
Right.
Two
So
years
those 2
in
years
Israel,
were very
66 to
formative.
68 were really formative.
Maybe you can tell about sneaking through the Mandelbaum gates.
Right. Well, I did it the other way.
Yeah.
At Christmas time, the Mandelbaum gate would be open for non-Jews to go back and forth. Jordan would only allow you to go one direction. It didn't want to make it easy for tourists to go from Israel to Jordan and then back to Israel. So you were either allowed going into Jordan or going out. And it was very hard for tour groups to arrange it. And so most people just didn't come to Israel. They either went one place or the other. But at Christmas time, foreigners in Israel could get special permission to go across the Mandelbaum Gate, ostensibly go to Bethlehem and then come back. And lots of my fellow students at the Hebrew University went and got permission, and you had to say you were Christian. And I just said, I don't want to do that. But then they came back with such interesting stories. I said, I want to do that. So we had a very long break between, somehow it worked out before Pesach. I think we had a 2 or 3 week break at the university. My sister then had a Fulbright, and she was in England. So we arranged to meet in Greece. We went to Athens and then by train to Istanbul. And then when she flew back to England, I flew to Beirut and went by car from Beirut to Damascus to Amman, and then to Jerusalem, and then through the Mandelbaum Gate. When she had been a student, she was at Hunter. She had a close friend who was a member of the royal family. Her husband was the ambassador, the Jordanian ambassador to the UN. And when he went back to Amman, his wife stayed to finish her degree at Hunter. She used to come to our house Friday night for dinner all the time. Wow. And so I went to visit Safa in Amman, and then I went to Jerusalem, and I woke up the first morning, and of course I wanted to find the wall, but I was a little hesitant to ask, and they were literally street urchins, messed up, little dirty kids running around, said, we'll show you to the Dome of the Rock, we'll show you to this, and if you want, to the Wailing Wall, as they called it. So I said, I'd like to see the Wailing Wall, and nonchalantly. And I went there, and it was then, if you remember, the pictures from before 67, it was a thin alleyway, maybe, I don't know, half the size of this auditorium. And I stood there, and I just looked, and I took pictures, and I just thought of how many Jews would like to be here and do this and see it. And then a guide group came, an English-speaking group with an English-speaking Jordanian guide, and he said this was the holiest place for Jews until 48. They'd come, and then he was sort of derogatory. They'd pray, and they'd cry, and they'd scratch themselves, and, it's sort of... And then he said, but now they don't come anymore. Okay, let's continue on to the Via della Rosa or something like that. And then I went up to Mount of Olives. Of course, you couldn't go to Mount Scopus because that was still held by Israel. And I stood at the hotel on the top above the wrecked cemetery, and I walked on, roads that had cemetery stones on them and things like that. I didn't go into the cemetery. The hotel was a site Israelis very often on a Saturday night would go up to, or even not just a Saturday night, but to Har Zion, to Mount Zion, and from there you could sort of see. You couldn't see a damn thing, but we would look into the old city or look across to Har Hatzofim and Har Zaitim, Mount Scopus and Mount Olives. And the Intercontinental looked so intriguing, the lights. So I went up there and I stood there and I looked across and I saw, at that point, the tallest building in Jerusalem was what still is maybe the Yimka. YMCA, and you see the King David Hotel, and then you could see the apartment house above the Supersal on Agron, which was then one of the tallest buildings in Jerusalem. And I looked at it and said, I've got enough stories here for a lifetime. I'd gone to Jericho, I hadn't gone to Petra. I said, I'm going home. And so I got my bags and I crossed through the man. You had to get permission to pass. I'd gotten that in Beirut, the visa to go back. And I crossed, and there was sort of, I think, a barrier that they'd lifted. I walked across, and I went into the Mandelbaum, the house. It was Dr. Mandelbaum. I think he was a physician, an eye doctor. His home, which was now maintained by the border police. And I handed them my new passport. I had gotten a new passport in Athens without any Israel stamps. And they said, where are you coming from? And I started to say in Hebrew, I said, Mi Yarden. And they looked up. I said, Mi Yarden Eiti B'Suria. I was in Syria, and then I was in Beirut. They asked, and the other guy put down whatever he was doing, and they started to ask me questions. And you go to the Kotel, and you do this and do that. And so after a while, I said, okay, enough. And they called the taxi for me. I went outside, take a taxi out to the dorm. And as I walked out, one said, they thought I was already out of the door. One said, Yesh la beitzim.
She's got a lot of courage.
He cleaned it up. And the other one said, Aval ein la seichel. She has no seichel. So I've been, I sort of been doing these things. And then I came back and I decided I wanted to do Jewish studies, Jewish history. And I went to Brandeis. And then while I was at Brandeis, I was in Israel, of course, during the Six-Day War. So then I got to go back to all the places I had seen before, and it was seeing them in a very different light, including when the day they opened the Kotel to the public. I think it was Shavuot of 67, which was maybe 10 days after the war, walking with streams of people around the edge of the old city to the Kotel. But then I came back to Brandeis, and I think it was 72. David Roskies, whom I know has lectured here, and the great, wonderful and terrific scholar of Yiddish literature, had been in the Soviet Union. He called me up. I said, how'd you get to the Soviet Union? He said, well, he was a little surreptitious about it, but essentially what was happening, and now we talk about it publicly, is that Israelis couldn't get to the Soviet Union anymore because the Soviet Union had broken ties with Israel in 67. So what Israel was doing, it was finding Jews with countries with strong passports, British Jews, American Jews, Canadian Jews, French, and finding people who also had a strong connection to Israel, very often were fluent in Hebrew, and asking them to go quietly, particularly at times of the holidays, to make contact with refuseniks, to bring out names of people who wanted invitations, and then Israel would find something called the Lishka, the office, and it was in the Prime Minister's office. Gal Beckerman writes about this in his wonderful book, When They Come for Us, We Will Be Gone. And they would send us in twos and maybe threes, and people would go quietly. So I went with a friend to Russia, first to Moscow, and then we were in Kiev shortly, and then we were in Chernovitz, and we were supposed to go to Kishinev and end up back in Kiev. And we were for a different holiday, for Rosh Hashanah in Moscow, Yom Kippur in Chernovitz, etc., through the Chagim. And we met refuseniks in Moscow, and I was invited on the first night of Rosh Hashanah. They spotted us and we sort of had been told how to reach them, how to find them. I don't remember exactly how. And we were invited back to one of their homes where they showed slides in a very old-fashioned way of the first bar mitzvah. One of the refusenik children had a bar mitzvah at the shul and the celebration. And then we hung out with them for a lot. I met Ida Nudel. And she was just beginning to be part of the refusenik movement. It was when Sharansky was beginning. Someone pointed out to me, said, that's Anatoly Sharansky. He's a new, he's just getting involved, et cetera, et cetera. And then we went to Chernovitz, and we got hoodwinked in Chernovitz. We met some young people outside the synagogue who clearly were with the KGB. And they reported on us. But so that on the day we were supposed to go to Kishinev, we were taken out of the country. But I had a very powerful experience, and it brings together a lot of the strands that you're asking about. On Kol Nidre, I was up in the women's section. It was hot. It was crowded, and I said,
"Where is this?"
In Chernovitz. Chernovitz is in Bukovina. It was a city. What was 80% Jewish, something like that. 90% Jewish. Paul Celan came from there. Ruth Weiss was born in Chernovitz. David Roski's older sister.
Who will be speaking in our History Matters series? Yes.
Voden. Why am I not surprised? I spent the whole Kol Nidre night outside on the street, talking to people. And then the next morning, we didn't even go into shul. The women's section, again, was so crowded. It was really unpleasant. But came time for Yizkor. My father had passed away right before Pesach that year. So I said, I want to say Yizkor. So I asked, is it time for Yizkor? And finally, when it was Yizkor time, the courtyard of the synagogue, the big windows, very typical kind of architecture, and they yelled out of the window to the 1,000 people standing on the street, Yizkor. And everyone got quiet. And I had a little siddur with me. It was actually a Tzahal siddur. And I opened it up to find Yizkor, and I began to say it. And there was murmuring in the crowd, that clearly here was a Western young woman able to find her way through the Siddur. And then people asked me to say Yizkor for them. Because one woman who had sort of attached herself to me said, that's we talked in a little bit of Yiddish. I had gone to the YIVO Weinreich program, which was then at Columbia, to prepare. So I had a little bit of Yiddish and German, et cetera. So I said, do you have anybody to say it for you? She said no. So I said it for her husband, her children, family members, and that was very, very powerful.
So these experiences, Israel and then this trip to the Soviet Union, clearly played a significant role in forming you as a Jew.
As a Jew, as an activist.
As an activist.
And
how about your sense of Jewish history?
And as someone interested in Jewish history as well.
What did those two experiences do for your sense of Jewish history?
Sense of wanting to know, wanting to better understand, there's a little town outside of Saragara. And we went to visit it because people I know had relatives buried there, and they're Heschels, they're Avraham Yeshua's in that. And I told Susie a couple of years later.
Susanna Heschel.
Yes, Susanna Heschel, and she said, yes, that's where my family was from. Avraham Yeshua Heschel, Avraham Yeshua, or sometimes just Avraham Yeshua. It was a sense of wanting to know more, wanting to be connected. But they also came from the family. Mm-hmm. My parents loved Jewish history, so we'd go to visit old synagogues. We'd go to different synagogues, Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. We'd go, just seeing places of Jewish history. There was a real sense of wanting to be connected.
But at this time in your 20s, early 20s, you developed this sense that this was your calling.
Yes, and
what was that like? What was the calling?
Well, the calling was that I wanted to find a way of studying Jewish history which would take me into the archives. I mean, I did archival work and did, the old boring work where you sit there and you turn the page looking for something that's going to tell you something, and usually you don't know what it's going to tell you till you've gotten to 5 boxes later, so you have to go back and find it, etc. Because you don't connect something, you don't realize the significance of something. It's the joy of research. Yeah. But it was, remember, this is Vietnam. I'd been in Israel during the Six-Day War. Kennedy's, I remember I was in Israel when Robert Kennedy was killed. Civil rights. There was a sense of wanting to study history, but also wanting to be part of what was going on. So those two things were linked.
Activism and the vocation of the historian were entwined.
Yes.
In ways that seem relevant and possible today?
I think so. I think much more acceptable today. In that time, you know, if you were too much involved in contemporary issues, you weren't serious. You know, and the fact that I was interested in very contemporary stuff in the beginning, is she really serious? Is it more activism? Is it journalism? Is it history?
Right.
You know, it just was something I felt, there was a drive.
In your own work, do you think that still accurately reflects who you are?
Yes, I think even
historian
more so
and
now.
activist?
Well, certainly, I mean, you can't ignore, I had this little trial.
Yes,
Some of you
we'll
may know
get to
about
that,
it.
yeah.
And that certainly had a big impact. But I was already involved in that before. When I wrote, the book, my first book, Beyond Belief, The American Press and the Coming of the Holocaust, 33 to 45. In the book, in the introduction, I tell the story of how this book originated. I was teaching one of my first courses on the history of the Holocaust. It was at the University of Washington, where I first started my career, in Seattle. And I was giving a lecture on America and the Holocaust, and I was talking about information and knowledge. I was saying, you had information, but did it transmit into knowledge? And I was talking about showing them documents, what the Congress knew, what the White House knew, what the State Department knew. I had done this whole thing, and in the middle of the lecture, one student said, but what could goes back a long time, what could my parents have known? Today they'd say, what could my grandparents have known? And I say, well, if all this information was available to the White, they must have known a lot. And the student then said, I don't believe you. And it's almost like what happened when Jan Karski came to this country. Jan Karski, the Polish Gentile, was trying to alert the world. This is very powerful. If you haven't seen, you have to have Sitzfleisch, but watch Lanzmann's Shoah. You know, it's 9.5 hours. You have to have like a relationship with the movie. But Karski is in there, and he's interviewed. Karski had been in the Warsaw Ghetto. I believe he goes to Treblinka, I forget which camp he goes to. And then the Polish underground sneaks him out across Europe, gets to London to arouse the world about the Shoah. And then he comes to this country. And he's a famous meeting with Felix Frankfurter, who was then on the Supreme Court. And he tells him the story of what's happening. And Frankfurter says, I can't believe you. Mm-hmm. And Karski says, are you calling me a liar? He says, no, not at all. He said, it's not that I don't believe you. It's that I can't believe you. So here was a student asking, what could my parents have known? I said, and I assumed they could have known a lot. And he says, I can't believe that.
So here's what you write in the opening of that book, Beyond Belief, 1986. During the 1930s and 1940s, Americans could have saved thousands and maybe even hundreds of thousands of Jews, but did not do so. This is a terrible indictment which carries a heavy burden of responsibility and also raises some difficult questions. Can you speak to that?
Well, you know, it's such a heavy kind of thing. You know, very often there are many, particularly in the Jewish community, if people want to beat up on Franklin Roosevelt. And probably when I was writing that book and doing the research, I held him in greater contempt than I did by the end of the book, and certainly in the years of research since. The truth of the matter is that if you want to look at what Roosevelt was doing, you certainly have to look at what the Congress was doing. You know, and there was no desire to let Jews come here. 30s are the pivotal years. It was in the 30s that people could have been allowed to come. But if you look at the fate, as you know well, of the Wagner-Rogers bill, a bill introduced by Senator Wagner of New York and Representative Edith Norris Rogers of Massachusetts, a Democrat and a Republican, jointly introduced into the Congress after Kristallnacht. So I think it was introduced January of 39, to bring 10,000 Jewish children, 10,000 children over the course of, 10,000 a year over the course of 2 years, children whose parents were either in concentration camps or had been arrested or whatever, and bring them here. And first, there is a very positive reaction. Seems like a nice thing. And then the protectionists, the Southern Democrats, the Republican Party almost en masse, the America Firsters begin to say, well, these are kids who were educated in Nazi Germany. Why do we want to have them here? It's an anti-Semitism mixed with it's a xenophobia, yep. Anti-immigration, anti-Semitism, all wrapped up together. And the bill died. The bill comes out of committee saying that these 20,000 children can come in, and they don't add the word Jewish. And the Jewish community is behind the bill, federations and other groups, but they're very quiet because they are told that if you become too out front, it will sink the chances of the bill passing. Anti-Semitism was rampant in this country. Father Coughlin, you just saw the letter. He had hundreds of thousands, if not millions of listeners to his program on CBS radio, which was overtly anti-Semitic, and which CBS didn't take off till after the war started. That letter, I think, was 1940. So it's the war started till after Pearl Harbor, 41, when America gets into the war. So the bill comes out of committee. Instead of 20,000 children in addition to the existing quotas from each of these countries. Remember, we had quota systems there, which heavily favored the British Isles and Northern Europe, the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Denmark. Just the history, just the facts, as Sergeant Friday would say, but only to women. Do you know that? There's a little aside. In Dragnet, who remembers Dragnet? When Sergeant Friday would say just the facts, ma'am, it was only to women that he would say that, because women were portrayed as getting all his stuff. Anyway, that's for another talk.
The gender implications of Dragnet.
Yes, right.
That'll be next week.
Well,
okay.
For next week. So that 20,000 places in the quotas would be reserved for children. And the supporters, Senator Wagner and Representative Rogers, let it die, because rather than liberalizing the immigration, you suddenly were limited to having to find 20,000 children. But the story of the St. Louis, which happens a few months later, June of '39. It's very easy to say Roosevelt sent it back, but Roosevelt at that point was trying to get Lend-Lease through the Congress. He was trying to get armament bills through, and it was made very clear to him that if you let these 900 people in, that's not going to happen. I'm not saying that he was heartbroken about having to do it. He was a cold, calculating politician. But the sentiment in the country at large was one: we don't want immigrants, we don't want refugees, even worse, and even worse, we don't want Jews.
Right. Well, I mean, it seems too obvious to pass on, but what do we learn from this? And do you look, the 20th century has been littered with ethnic cleansing, mass murder, genocide, xenophobia, anti-immigration rhetoric, including in this country. What do we learn from this terrible example?
To say that now, especially, a speech tonight that will be given, which will deal a lot with immigration, and I think there are many Jews who have very mixed feelings about, there's certainly one of the president's chief advisors on this issue is a man of Jewish heritage. It's such a difficult question, because it's so easy. We just started a new semester, and I'm teaching history of the Holocaust, and one section, of course, is on the barriers to escape. Why didn't people leave? They did. By the way, as Marion Kaplan, who is at NYU, wonderful Jewish historian, writes makes the point in her book between Dignity and Despair on Jewish life in Nazi Germany, 1933 to 1945, that over close to 60%, I used to say over 50%, but it's really, I just checked, it's close to 60% of German Jews left Germany. And they went to very safe places. They went to Paris. They went to Brussels. The most famous victim of the Holocaust, her family left Frankfurt in 1933. They got up and they left mid-33. And they went to a very safe place, Amsterdam. I just was in Amsterdam, just came back on Thursday night, and I got to visit the Anne Frank House, which I'd done before, but I went through with the director of the Anne Frank House at 8 o'clock in the morning when there was no one else there. It was a very powerful experience. And we talked about that, you know. I mean, Anne Frank saves the reputation of the Netherlands, because the Netherlands has probably, in Western Europe, the highest percentage.
70%,
I think the population, may even be higher, of the Jewish population of the Netherlands was 140,000, of whom 104,000 are killed. Yep. So, but for Anne Frank, you know, it would be a very different story. Yep. So, you know, people left. Yep. And we look today at what's going on now, and I think many of us, many American Jews, are conflicted because it's more complicated. Many of the people who are coming are people that we feel are not friendly to us, and yet I would bet if I asked how many people in this auditorium going back 2, maximum 3 generations, are children of immigrants. And we have sitting here, I just know it, we have rabbis, and we have PhDs, and we have entrepreneurs, and we have people who have contributed so much. And yet on paper, if you had been looked at, if someone had looked at my father's, you know, prospects for coming to this country, they would have said, you know, what is he doesn't have a skill, doesn't. Yet, you know, he has 2 PhDs and a child and children and an MBA and grandchildren and accomplished. So.
All right, so we're going to get back to the present, I can assure you, but I want to go back to your past. You wrote your dissertation on a topic in American Jewish history.
American Zionist history.
American Zionist history.
I was studying with a too easily forgotten his Jewish historian, Ben Halpern at Brandeis, and he was very interested in American Zionist history, and he pushed me in this direction. Right. I think had it been a few years later, I probably would have done America and the Holocaust.
Okay. So what prompted that turn?
The turn
that manifests itself in Beyond Belief, and then the next
I
book.
went to the University of Washington. I was their first professor of Jewish studies, and now they have a program, one of the biggest programs, very robust program. And the students, the courses were oversubscribed from the day it was announced that, you know, before the students even knew who I was, or. And they came to me and they said, would you ever teach a course on the Holocaust? So I began to figure out how I would do that. It was really an autodidact.
When was that?
That was, I would say, 75, 76.
And were there syllabi floating around?
Very few.
Yeah.
You really had to figure it out yourself. And there was Hilberg. There was Raoul Hilberg's great work. And there were a couple of other things, you know, Primo Levi and other things were out. But there weren't, and right around that time, Lucy Davidovich was writing. She had been at the American Jewish Committee, but now I think she had left at that point. And Berman House.
The War Against the Jews?
No, this was before. Was publishing books of documents. Professor Twersky did one on Rambam. They're books, translations of documents. And I think there were about 5 or 6 in the series.
So this was a course on the Holocaust before Holocaust studies.
And Lucy Davidovich did the one on Holocaust documents. And because of that, she wrote War Against the Jews. So I had that book, but it's very meager compared to what we have today. And over the course of the years, I developed more and more interest in it. And then this student challenged me, saying, what could my parents have known? I said, I'm going to write that book. I'm going to figure it out.
And that became Beyond Belief.
Beyond Belief.
And then you turned your attention to the phenomenon of Holocaust denial.
Yeah, not willing.
Denying the Holocaust.
Yeah, not.
How did that happen?
How did that happen? Well, I don't know. I'm going to do a shameless plug. I don't know if you've seen my TED Talk, which crossed 1 million.
Whoa.
So. But we can go more than that. So go home and Google Lipstadt plus TED Talks.
1,247,000, I
No,
think, is the
right.
capacity of our auditorium.
43,000, 1,044,000, something like that. I promise my students that if they bring it up to 1,000,001 by the end of the semester, they get a party. So they're all home, contacting their entire family, et cetera. And I had finished Beyond Belief, and at that point, unlike later in my career, I didn't have a book on the burner that I wanted to do. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. Happened to be in Jerusalem, and I bumped into Yehuda Bauer, who knew me and knew me well, knew my work, loved Beyond Belief. And he said, Deborah, do you have time for coffee? Come have coffee with me and Yisrael Gutman. Yisrael Gutman, who is a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto and was a blessed memory, one of the experts on the history of the Warsaw Ghetto and the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And I said, sure. Invited me to have coffee, these two senior, much respected people from whom I had learned so much. And they said, yes, we have an idea for you for a research project. So now I was both delighted and intrigued. So I went, and they said to me, we think you should write about Holocaust denial. And I laughed. I thought this was completely ludicrous. I mean, I didn't guffaw, but I said, you mean the flat earth people? You take them seriously? And they both said yes. And they both were at that point developing what became the Sassoon Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at the Hebrew University. So they were looking at forms of anti-Semitism. And they said, yes, we take it seriously and we see it as a form of anti-Semitism, but we're not really sure what it is and how is it gaining any traction. So I figured, completely wrong, that I would spend 2-3 years writing the book. I'd write that being my second book, and then Fertig finished, Gamarnu, I'd move on to other things. I'd come back to America and the Holocaust. And of course, it changed my life.
Tell us why.
Well, it changed my life because is David Ellenson? Jackie's here. I don't know if David's not. Okay, so David Ellenson said to me when the book was just coming, I said, Deborah, this book is going to change your life. I said, forget it. Who's interested in Holocaust denial? So David was prescient in that. But it changed in a number of ways. First of all, I began to take it seriously as I studied it because I saw, and this brings us right smack into today, I saw that the tactics of denial had been around from almost immediately after the war. When Eichmann is in Argentina, meeting with these German expats who were in Argentina, not all Nazis, but some had come to Argentina before, in the 30s, business and other things, and he was telling them what he had done during the war and what had happened during the war. They said, oh, that's not true. That couldn't be true. And they began to deny it, even though here you had Eichmann telling them what happened. Denial had been around for a while, but in the 70s, it got a new modus operandi. The beliefs were the same, but it began to insist, the followers began to insist on being called revisionists as opposed to deniers.
A term that you eschew.
Yes, very much, very strongly so. The earlier ones had been called revisionists, but now it became a fact in all their journals and all their institutes, because they said, we're not anti-Semites. We're not against the Jews. We're not denying anything. We want to revise mistakes in history. You could go to their meetings and you would look and you wouldn't see a swastika, you wouldn't see an SS-like uniform. There had been a movie around that time, a little documentary called California Reich, on neo-Nazis in California. These little kids dressed up in SS-like uniforms and Sig Heiling and things like that. And that's not what you would find in the Institute for Historical Review in Newport Beach, California, where it was then, or in their journal, the Journal for Historical Review. They presented them themselves as a group that wanted to revise mistakes in history. In fact, they even got they rented the Arrowhead Center, which belonged to UCLA, for a retreat, because whoever was the bureaucrat in charge looked and said it's a historical institute. You would look at the programs for their conferences. Nothing about it smacked of anti-Semitism, nothing about it smacked of Holocaust denial, but it was all about that. So it was wolf in sheep's clothing.
Why was that? What
Because
was
that's
that shift in marketing strategy?
A tactic.
Yeah.
A tactic.
Who was the architect of that?
The architect Willis Carto, to a great extent, and some of his followers, that if you were overtly pro-Nazi, if you carried swastikas, if you dressed in sort of, pseudo-SS kind style uniforms, people would look at you and say, oh my God, I don't want to be associated with them. But if you presented yourself as mainline historians, maybe even edgy historians, doing serious work, just asking questions, well, that's something that I could find intriguing. You know where you see this precisely today? In the alt-right. The alt-right who were amongst the organizers of the march in Charlottesville. Go look at the videos of the march in Charlottesville. The guys look like they came, mainly guys, not only, look like they came out of a J. Crew catalog. Polo shirts, khakis. You see there's one swastika, one flag with a swastika. They're carrying the flags of their organizations, which have swastika-like symbols on them. I think The Atlantic, in fact, I believe it was The Atlantic or The New Yorker, did a guide to the symbols that you see in Charlottesville. But no, and they said, oh, we're just here to protest about the monuments. That's what we're here about.
So that book, go ahead. Do you want to
so that change in tactics, again, linked me with a group that was trying to revise history with a contemporary kind of thing. Now, in the book, I devoted 100 words, 200 words. I really have to count them because it so impacted my life, to David Irving. And I called him the most dangerous of deniers because he was the one who was
knew the documents. Right.
He knew the documents. He was seen as an edgy historical writer. He had written a book in '78 before he openly associates with the deniers at the end of the '80s after the Zundel trial in Canada and Toronto. But he wrote a book in '78 called Hitler's War, which he argues that I know it sounds ridiculous, but it is ridiculous. Hitler didn't know about the Holocaust, and when he found out about it, he tried to stop it. And Hitler was the best friend the Jews had in Germany. So I looked at the reviews of this book, and many reviewers said, well, this is a little bit crazy, that thesis is crazy, but the rest of what he has to say is interesting. Instead of saying, anybody who could say this, I'm not going to trust whatever else he has to say. So I said his books, when he would write his books, they'd be reviewed in TLS, Times Literary Supplement, or in New York Review of Books. They might pan them, but they'd review them.
So those 100 words caught his attention.
Right.
This book that you published in 1993, which won a National Jewish Book Award, caught his attention 2 years later, and then in 1996.
And when it came out in England, about 4 or 5 months after it came out in England, Penguin brought it out. He brought a suit against me. And again, when I got the letter that he was suing me, once again, having laughed when I first heard about Holocaust denial and when Professors Bauer and Gutmann proposed it, I laughed again. I said, this guy is a denier and he's proud of it. This is a guy who says, I'm going to sink the battleship Auschwitz. This is a guy who says about a survivor in Melbourne, Australia, how much money have you made from having that number tattooed on your arm? He testified at the Zundel trial that there were no gas chambers. What is this man saying he's not? So I thought it was ridiculous. And then I thought it was not so ridiculous because the letters kept coming. And I knew also that publishers didn't have a great track record of standing behind their authors. And serendipitously, in both its meaning, by chance and good fortune, a person I knew in England who worked for the Jewish community on issues of security and research, et cetera, Mike Wine, wrote a lot. We'd been at conferences together, called me, and we were talking, and he knew about the suit against me because the papers had been filed in the court.
And the burden of proof lay
with
you.
The British legal system is the mirror image of the American legal system. In America, if I say you libeled me, I have to prove you libeled me. In Britain, if I say you libeled me, you as the author of the words have to prove the truth of what you said. So the burden of proof, in America, you can just say, ignore it, prove that I libeled you. In Britain, if you ignore it, your claimant, the person who's brought the proceedings against you, wins by default. On top of which, you have, as a result of the Supreme Court case of New York Times v. Sullivan, which I think is 63, 64, where the New York Times had written about I believe it was a cop or a policeman in either Birmingham, or in Selma, who had sick dogs on civil rights protesters. And he had sued them for libel. And the New York Times fought back, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Times argued, and the judges ruled in the Times' favor, that a public figure, someone who voluntarily puts themselves in the public eye. So it began with government officials, someone who worked for the government, this sheriff in the South, loses the right to sue for libel on the issue of their professional issues, because if they had the right to sue for libel, it would have a chilling effect on the First Amendment. And the First Amendment took precedence in that. Eventually, it was expanded to include authors. That's why in other countries, in Britain, you can sue when you get a lousy review. In America, you can't. You've written the book, you've put it out there. People have a right to say whatever they want.
Let's pause here and ask, what are your views of Holocaust denial and free speech?
I am against laws outlawing Holocaust denial. In fact, again, you can go to YouTube. I spoke at the Oxford Union on this. You know, they call themselves one of the oldest existing debating societies in the Western world. I say they've never been to a Friday night dinner at some most Jewish families I know. I'll tell a funny story about a Jewish historian, Paula Hyman of blessed memory, from whom we learned so much, and some very good friends of hers are here tonight. Paula told me that when her eldest daughter was applying for entry into Yale, she had a stress interview. She went to the faculty member who was interviewing her, and it was stressful, and it was challenging, and it was really, a bit disconcerting. So I said, well, what was her reaction? And Paula's husband was standing there, and he said, she thought it was dinner at our house. So, how did I get to Paula Hyman?
Free speech.
Free speech. Yeah. But I don't believe, thank you, I don't believe in laws outlawing Holocaust denial. First of all, I have trouble with hate speech laws because they can get very dicey. Not
in Europe?
Certainly in Europe. America, you couldn't have laws outlawing Holocaust denial because, again, the First Amendment may be hanging on by its fingernails, but it's still hanging on. It would be contrary to the First Amendment. So, on a free speech issue. But there's another issue here as well, and this applies to countries which don't have the First Amendment. I think laws against Holocaust denial suggest that we don't have the facts to answer, that we have to depend on laws to protect the history, when the facts themselves will do it, number one. Number two, I'm afraid, and I've only become more frightened in recent years, of ceding to politicians control over what can and cannot be said.
Such as we are seeing in Poland.
We're seeing in Poland, such as we're seeing in many places. I think that it suggests that I don't trust the politicians. I mean, to give the politicians the right to determine this is acceptable and this isn't acceptable. I think all those things, and certainly free speech trumps, with a small t, trumps the idea of protecting the history. Believe me, I hate deniers. I hate Holocaust denial. This is being taped. That was a bad thing to say. I dislike it very much. I hate it.
Is it a thing of the past?
The hardcore denial, the denial of the history, if you had asked me this 2 years ago, I would have said that's pretty much a thing of the past. It's less so now.
Where is it now?
Certainly in groups, I mentioned alt-right, these groups that were marching in Charlottesville, the white supremacist groups, the white nationalist
The Daily
groups.
Stormer.
Yes, exactly. The Daily Stormer. That's hardcore denial. It didn't happen. The Jews are making it up. They're exaggerating. They were really criminals. They were subversive. But there's another form of Holocaust denial, and I think I may have created these categories. I'm not. I think so. I'm not sure. What I call softcore denial. Because, and usually we use hardcore and softcore in relation to pornography. Well, I do that on purpose because I think denial of history is pornographic history. Whether you're talking about the Holocaust, whether you're talking about the Armenian genocide, whether you're talking about Srebrenica, whether you're talking about Rwanda, it's pornographic. It's doing to the victims and the survivors. It's a double killing. I think Alvin Rosenfeld coined that term. So what we see today also is softcore denial. Softcore denial, which says, oh, I'm not denying. Marie Le Pen and his daughter Marine Le Pen. Marie Le Pen, long-term right-wing leader in France, talks about Auschwitz and the gas chambers as a detail in history. Well, if they're just, he's not denying it, but it's a detail in history. Well, if it's a detail in history, why are we hearing so much about it, would be the natural question. And the answer, of course, is the Jews. The Jews insist on talking about it. The Jews insist on, and in relationship to Israel, certainly. Look, you can disagree with Israel's policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians from A to Z. You can think they're all wrong. You think they're not productive. You can think that they're not. You can think whatever you want to think. But to talk about it as a genocide is to misrepresent what is going on and so misrepresent what genocide is, not just against the Jews, but against other peoples as well. You can talk about the mistakes made by the IDF. The IDF is an army made up of human beings. Yes, it claims and it prides itself on having very tarat haneshek, the purity of arms, that the way arms and force should be used. But you can think they've made horrendous mistakes. But to talk about the Nazi-like tactics of the IDF is grossly misrepresenting. It's a form of softcore denial and a form of anti-Semitism.
Right, so that leads to the question about the persistence of anti-Semitism today. You've spent some time meditating on that. I think you have a book due out.
I'm finishing, right. We're editing it now. It's in the process of being edited. My editor is here, so she's probably wondering why I'm not home editing it, right.
Our colleague Robert Wistrich called anti-Semitism the longest hatred.
Right.
How do you understand the malleability,
it's amazing.
The endurance of the phenomenon,
yes,
and what does it look like today for you?
The endurance of the phenomenon, look, I can direct a line from the origins of anti-Semitism, which I see in the New Testament in the story of the death of Jesus. Yes, there were attacks on Jews before, but I believe they fall much more into the category of warfare, of groups minority groups being challenged, etc. But if you look at the way the death of Jesus is depicted in the New Testament and was taught by church fathers, and they were mainly church fathers, for millennia after that, certain elements persisted. The Jews, of course, everybody in the story is Jewish. Jesus is Jewish, the Jews are Jewish, but that doesn't matter. The Jews killed Jesus. Sort of like the whites killed Kennedy. I don't know what a good analogy would be. Except for the Romans who actually killed him. So if you acknowledge that the Romans actually killed him, these Jews were managed in their nefarious ways to get the greatest power extant in the world at that time, Rome, the Roman Empire, to crucify this pure, innocent Son of God, individual who could have brought so much love and life and goodness to the world. Why? Because he wanted to chase the money changers out of the temple. So there you have the basic elements of anti-Semitism. Nefarious, mendacious ways of the Jews conniving, managed to get money, manage to get, they are small in number, but look, they get Rome to do the killing, and go right through, go to the blood libels, killing Gentile children for use in Passover. It's a reenactment of the deicide, or to denial. If you were to ask a denier, if he's told you how this never happened, well, why have the Jews made up this myth? He will have a very simple answer, very straightforward answer. He'll say, what did the Jews get out of the Holocaust? And what is the traditional answer that's given? Which is wrong, because we give that answer. But if you look at the Zionist history and the history of Israel, there was the Peel Commission, 36, which, a British commission, which...
Recommendation 37.
Right, exactly, which called for dividing the area up into Jewish political entities and Arab political entities. In other words, there would have been something before. And if Israel had been a direct result of the Holocaust, it would have been created in 45, 46. It's a result of the Brits pulling out. It's much more complicated. But that's an answer that's often given. And what else did they get out of the Holocaust? Reparations, which is a fancy word for money. So there you have a rationale for creating this myth of the Holocaust, which is sort of brings you right back to traditional anti-Semitism. When Ms. I'm going to give a strange analogy here. When Ms. Magazine was first created, it was a supplement in New York Magazine, and there was an article in there by a woman named Jane O'Reilly, and she called it Click. And she talked about the click phenomenon, how for women, you sometimes suddenly realize you're being asked to do something that, if you're the only woman, let's say, at the table and the coffee is wheeled or there's coffee on the side, the woman is, would you serve the coffee? Or you have an idea and you say it and nobody pays attention, but when a man has the same idea, suddenly it's paid attention to. And she talked about the click phenomenon, how suddenly you realize, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. And when you use traditional prejudicial stereotypical characteristics, the Jews made this up, to get a state. It didn't matter that they were displacing another people. What do they care if they're hurting other people? They're only out for themselves. And they were so powerful that they got the Allies to plant all these documents and to spread this story. They got Germany to accept this moral burden and to pay billions of dollars, because otherwise they would have ensured that Germany didn't get back into the family of nations. So it's the same thing like with a racist stereotype, where someone will tell you, oh, I was held up, I was mugged. Was he black? Or the person was, or if the person says it happened to be a black individual, of course, because it fits the stereotype. Mm-hmm. It fits for prejudice to work, the stereotype has to make sense. So if you say African Americans are what they are because they're conniving and money hungry, it doesn't make sense. That's the Jewish stereotype. But if you say they're shiftless and lazy, that's not what they are, but that's the stereotype associated with African Americans. It makes sense. You say, oh, he's Italian, he's mafioso, it makes sense.
Right. So, for a small and dispersed people, the Jews have clearly had a monumental impact. And one of the manifestations is, with all of the malleable images that the anti-Semitic arsenal contains, the structural function of the Jew as the classic other remains. Yeah. And we, as historians, ask but ultimately often fail to answer that question. Why? We know the what.
I don't know.
We know the dynamics of how it operates. Why?
I think partially, it's not a great answer. I think it's a good answer. What I'm going to give you is a good answer, but it's not a sufficient answer, is that by all rights of history, we shouldn't be here. We should have disappeared a lot. We should have assimilated, acculturated, and then assimilated. We shouldn't be here. 70 years ago, 1 out of every 3 of us, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, was murdered. We shouldn't be here. Never before did a nation go to such efforts to kill an entire people outside their boundaries. In summer of 44, after the landing at Normandy, they take boats and go to the Isle of Rhodes, one of the oldest Jewish communities, probably as old, if not older, than the Jewish community in Rome. and they strip it of the Jews. There was, Mishugala Davar, they were fixated on this killing. We shouldn't have survived. We shouldn't have flourished. But not just the Holocaust, the Spanish Inquisition, the pogroms, the Chmielnicki pogroms, 1648, the Crusades. There's so many different examples. And just forgetting the anti-Semitism. Small in number, we should have disappeared into the majority. That's what Martin Luther thought would happen when he wrote his first essay. Yes, in the first essay.
The second essay.
He
got angry that they
kill
didn't
them all.
convert. Yeah.
But I think that's part of it. Yeah. And I can't explain to you how that happened.
Okay, I have two final questions before we open up for questions from the audience. First, what are you concerned about in terms of anti-Semitism today? Can you tell us?
Yes.
As you undertake this?
Two things I'm concerned about. A, I see a resurgence entering the conversation, both from the right and from the left.
Say more about
the same. Yeah, Ben Halpern, my teacher, used to say the one place the right and the left meet is on anti-Semitism. And the bigger danger I see is that, it goes back to one of the great Jewish thinkers and the father of a great Jewish historian, Shimon Ravidovich, Israel, the Ever-Dying People. If you haven't read the essay, read the essay.
It was mentioned here last week.
Oh, okay.
With this picture up on the screen.
Okay, so Shimon Ravidovich, who created the Near Eastern and Judaic Studies, the first department of Jewish studies in the United States at Brandeis, has a classic essay, an iconic essay, which I think has impacted all of us. It's called Israel, the Ever-Dying People. And he traces how, he begins with a Mishnah, I think. Yep. Begins with a Mishnah up through contemporary times, through the Zionist poets, Rambam and medieval rabbinic scholars, etc., all the way through, how every generation thought it was the final generation. How every generation thought, there's no one here who loves Torah. There's no one here who's concerned about Jewish life. Rambam, Maimonides, writes to the rabbis of southern France, no one cares about Torah and learning like you do. We are the end. Now, how wrong was that? But, and Ravidovich in the end, and then, who was it who said, Lemi ani amel, for whom do I...
Leib Gordon.
Yes, so the great Zionist poet. For whom do I write? Who's going to read my poetry? Who's going to care about this? Now, what Ravidovich says is it was a psychological coping mechanism. I don't know if he uses the word psychological, but that if you expected the worst, you were never surprised by it. The Jewish joke where the guy is sitting on a train and he's saying, "Oh, am I thirsty? And the person sitting in the compartment with him is going crazy. So he goes and brings him some water. The guy thanks him. He drinks some water. It's quiet in the train for a few minutes. And then it's a Jewish joke, so it's two endings. You can choose which ending you want. There's a pessimistic ending and a less pessimistic ending. After a few minutes, the guy who was so thirsty says, "Oi, was I thirsty? Oi." That's the optimistic ending. The pessimistic ending is he says, "Oi, will I be thirsty? Oi, will I be thirsty?" In other words, nothing surprises us. That's what Now, Ravidovich was saying it in an affirming kind of way. He was trying to understand this phenomenon. What I'm afraid of is for too many Jews, the fight against anti-Semitism becomes the raison d'etre, the reason for staying as Jews. It becomes the motivating force to be a Jew. I'm going to be a Jew. I'm going to do this, not to give hit. It's the same way Fackenheim, Emil Fackenheim.
614th commandment.
Thou shalt not hand Hitler a posthumous victory. Thou shalt live as Jews. People took that out of its context. I don't think Fackenheim meant it, but I'm going to keep kosher, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, not to hand Hitler a posthumous victory. And I say, dafka, it's afal pi, not dafka lahachis. It's not, don't be and do and be more firmly Jewish, not to hand the anti-Semites a victory, but afal pi. Nonetheless, afal pi sheyit mameo, we say about Elijah the prophet, even though he tarries. And one of the ships, like the Exodus, one of the other ships was called the afal pi chen, the nonetheless.
So how do you do that as someone who's devoted her life to the study of the Holocaust?
Of the destruction. You live as a Jew. However you define that, religiously, ethnically, academically, organization, but you live as a Jew, not, I'm going to show the anti-Semites, but because there's so much good stuff there. There's so much, I'm bringing coals to Newcastle, telling an audience who came out in freezing weather to listen to this conversation, and in a place, a center for Jewish history, but you find you don't ignore the negative, and you don't ignore those who will attack you. What is it, Talmud Bavli? Someone comes to kill you, get up early and kill him first. Talmud says it. Take action first. Don't sit around waiting for it to happen. But at the same time, that's not the reason why you are a Jew. Right. That's not the reason why you do what you do.
So let's return, in my final question, to history. How, after you're midway through a distinguished career as an historian, what do you understand to be the function of the historian? What do you understand to be the function of history in today's world?
Look, I think the function of history is for history's sake. You have to be careful of using it as a political, ideological, social cudgel. I think one of the reasons Jewish studies succeeded in the academy, particularly in its phase in the 60s. There was Jewish studies before, of course, Professor Sela Wittemar Baron, in a Center for Jewish History, is the icon at first chair in Jewish history at Columbia, first chair in America in Jewish history, and other great historians. They train, and I wasn't trained by Baron, but the people who trained me at Brandeis, it was history for history's sake. This is an academic profession. We're not here to be activists. We're not training. And I think in the early incarnations in the 60s and the 70s, the other identity or heritage studies programs, African American studies, in its first incarnation, not today, was more about activism.
But you exemplify the engaged historian for whom
I think
the perpetuation of the Jewish people is an extraordinarily important part of who you are.
Yet when
part of your.
When I sit down to write my history and do my history, I try to set that engagement aside, because I think if I let it infuse what I'm saying, it's not as valuable. Jan Gross will be here to talk next weekend again. It's something I will watch online. You look at the bill that's been introduced. Someone said to me, "Did you hear about this bill?" I said, "Yes, I know about it. I was in Poland a long time this summer. I'm going again in a few months. They said, imagine you can't say Polish concentration camps. I said, but that's true. They were not Polish concentration camps. The Germans built them. The Germans did that. If you go to Auschwitz, the town is called Auschwitz, and the camp is called Auschwitz. The Germans saw it not as in Poland, but as an extension of the Reich. So this person I was saying this to said, well, if the Poles had been smarter, they would have done it. It's crazy. I don't want to take one thing away from the Germans when it comes to the murder and the annihilation camps. And this person was shocked. I said, on the other hand, you have Poles who collaborated to talk to. So, in
criminalize
fact,
that.
Yes, there's some people who feel that the Polish concentration camp thing was put in there as a sop to say, well, they're right on that, but it's really about the collaboration. But we have to speak truth. We have to be honest about what we're saying. We can't take our history and say, I'm going to write a history that's going to motivate people to act one way or the other. In the book that I'm doing now, that I'm finishing up now on anti-Semitism here and now, it's structured as letters to a student and to a colleague, a Jewish student and a non-Jewish colleague, and they're composites. But what I've done is I've taken all the emails and letters and conversations I've had with colleagues and with students about anti-Semitism in the past 3, 4, 5 years since Gaza, I guess, and composited them. And it's sort of my most current kind of, because it's something that's happening now and not a historical element. But at the same time, we have to be willing to be truthful about even contemporary events. BDS. BDS anti-Semitism. The people who created BDS, if you look at the founding papers of the BDS movement, no question they call for the destruction of Israel, no question that there's an anti-Semitism that pervades them. But not everybody who joins BDS is necessarily anti-Semitic. Some kids who join it couldn't find Israel on a map, you know? It's hard, but it's there. But I think we have to be honest. Mm-hmm. We have to be honest as historians. We have to be honest in contemporary issues, even if sometimes it's difficult.
Right. Well, I'd love to probe for much longer the boundary between history and memory, which is a very important distinction. Right. But I think we'll see if we can get back to that. Let's open up now for questions from the audience. Yes, sir, right there. Judah, do you want to, the gentleman in the vest, right there. Yes, you.
Three somewhat side comments. I spent
in a short period of time.
I'm a retired academic anesthesiologist, having spent the first half of my career in Boston and the second half in St. Louis. St. Louis was a very interesting experience. I encountered people, I've been retired for some 20 plus years. St. Louis is a very interesting experience. One of my first encounters there was a colleague asking to see my horns and my tail. This is in the 1980s. This is, I was dealing with people from the Missouri Synod.
You know, I think we have, and I don't mean to interrupt, but we have a lot of questions, and I think, yeah, if you could make it, I think we'll just have time for one, though.
That indigenous to the American culture is this American Semitism that we've ignored over this period. The second.
So I want to make sure I understand. The first question was, is there an indigenous American anti-Semitism?
Yes.
Okay, so we'll give you one more question.
Okay. The second is a very quick story. Very quick. In January.
You know your audience, yeah.
In January 1943, despite people who said we had no knowledge of the Shoah then, my father received a letter from his nephews in Belarus describing how his four sisters had been machine gunned. We did have knowledge, and it was general knowledge. We did not acknowledge it.
Thank you. Okay. Deborah.
I think there has been, if you go upstairs to the American Jewish Historical Society, you saw examples of it in the introduction. If you go up and look at the library, we have studied American anti-Semitism. But if you look at American anti-Semitism in a comparative context, and here Professor Myers can speak to that easily just as well as I, you look at Europe, it's not embedded in American culture and tradition in the same way that it's embedded in European culture and tradition. And that's what makes it different. I think that it's there. No one is saying it's not there, but it's
constitutive of the very. It's not constitutive of the very sense of
a sense. And I would
nation.
say in Europe, in England, take England for example. In England, it was embedded in a way that people who went to Oxford and Cambridge in the 70s and the 80s can still talk about how they faced it and snide comments from professors and things like that. So it's here, but it's not embedded in that way. And in terms of information, I'm not sure your father could have gotten a letter. I don't know how he would have gotten a letter from Belarus in '43, but I can't, obviously it got to him some way. But yes, the information was available in December 42, December 17th, 1942. All the Allied nations, including the United States, acknowledge, this is 1 year after Pearl Harbor, that there is an extermination of, that's the word they use, of the Jews taking place in Europe, that 2 million Jews were already dead, and 4 million more stood in danger of losing their lives. We also have to remember, though, and here's the historian in me speaking, that in 42 and even through much of 43, the Allies were losing the war. So to have asked America to change the Allies to change its policies when it didn't look like we were going to win the war was a very touchy thing.
Let's see. Yes, please, right here. Hold on. Can you just hold on 1 second? We'll somehow reach. If you could send down the microphone, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Your lawyer for the trial was one of Britain's most remarkable and most successful Jews. And I wonder if you could just enlighten us a little bit about how your relationship started and developed in the context of your work.
Okay, well, it is a funny story. We still are very close. I'll be in London in a few weeks, and we're going to have Shabbos lunch together. Anthony Julius is a lawyer in England, solicitor. A solicitor prepares the case up to trial, and then the barrister, the guy in the wig, or the woman in the wig, brings it into the courtroom. And he specialized in press and libel law. And at some point, Princess Diana, after she had separated from Charles, approached him about representing her in some of her cases against the press. Particularly, if you remember, she went to the gym, and the gym owner planted cameras in the ceiling and took pictures of her in very, revealing ways. And he represented her a number of times, and then he represented her in her divorce suit. And when she said to him, "I want you to represent me in the divorce suit," he said, maybe you want one of my colleagues who specialize in divorce. This would be my first divorce case. And she said to him, "Don't worry, it's my first divorce, so we'll learn together." When I knew I was being sued and made contact with Mike Wine, who is both sort of a community organizer, but also writes scholarly articles about and looks at anti-Semitism in a very analytical way. And I was talking to him on the phone. I said, I really need my own lawyer. And he said, "There's one person you have to get." And I said, "Who's that?" And he said, "He's smart, he's and I think it's a man, so he said assertive. Been a woman, he probably would have said aggressive. He's smart. He does not abide anti-Semites, and I think he would do this for you, and probably pro bono if necessary." So having heard all the important words, smart, pro bono, I said, "What's his name?" And he said, "Anthony Julius." And I said, "Oh, I know who he is." And because Anthony, who is really a Renaissance man, while he was representing the princess and other cases as well, went back to university to get a PhD in comparative literature. And he wrote on T.S. Eliot and anti-Semitism and literary criticism, and essentially argued that anti-Semitism is a fundamental part of, it's not a little bits of Eliot's poetry here and there, but it's endemic. It's to Eliot's poetry, and that the critics had given him a free pass. Almost like what they did with David Irving initially. Oh, yes, well, anti-Semitism, we won't, that he's just writing that because he wants to be accepted by the modernist, or he's just writing that for, he doesn't really mean it. And the book had been reviewed in every place when it appeared, in part because of Anthony's notoriety as the princess's attorney. The divorce suit had been settled and felt in very favorable terms for Princess Diana. But everyone also marveled. The New Yorker profiled him and marveled at the fact that here was, a lawyer working full-time as a lawyer, produces this book, gets a PhD, and gets your attention, And so he was asked about it. He said, "Well, look, some lawyers play golf on Wednesday. I went and got a PhD. But he took on the case together with his colleague James Lipson, and they represented me for close to 2 years pro bono. And then, as the movie depicts, when it began to take over their entire caseload, they had to charge. But they became and they remained very close friends. And in fact, a good friend of mine, Chaim Seidler-Feller of UCLA Hillel, was recently in London, and he met Anthony Julius. He and his wife met Anthony Julius. They were anxious to meet him, and so I arranged for them to meet. And over lunch, Chaim asked him, "What's the best thing that came out of the trial in your opinion?" And he said, "My friendship with Deborah." And when Chaim told me that, I said I would have said exactly the same thing. So.
Yes, right in the middle there. Gentleman in the middle.
Come
And
on, women. We need more women's hands asking.
I know. I'm looking,
I know.
scanning definitely.
Do you think that Trump has been actively, or that he has been dog whistling to the alt-right, or do you?
I think I have no idea whether the president is an anti-Semite or a racist. In fact, I don't think he is. But I do think we've seen a lot of points, crucial points, where there have been these either dog whistles or use of material from those groups, going back to the picture of Hillary Clinton during the campaign in July of 2016 with the Jewish star and piles of money, or using stuff directly from the Daily Stormer and things like that, which means that somebody close to him is monitoring those sites, is drawing things from those sites. I think there's been, look, nice people don't march chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Nice people don't march chanting the Nazi slogan, "Blood and soil." Blood and soil was the essence of anti-Semitism. To the Nazis, the Jew could not be a German citizen. They did not have the proper blood, going to racial anti-Semitism, and they were not of the soil of the German soil. They were cosmopolitan. They were here, there, and everywhere. Nice people. So what I think it has done is, and it has given a new life to these groups. Whether meant to or not, I'm just talking about the outcome. It has encouraged them. You hear it from David Duke. You hear it from Richard Spencer. You hear it from many people.
Okay, I think we're going to take a batch of 3 questions so we get some more voices. Yes, I see you, but I'm going to actually go right up there for the first. Yes, the woman right there. You're going to be second. I see you. Yes, there are lots of other people with hands up, and the third person right there. So yes, please.
Thank you. When you were mentioning the reasons that the Jews should not be here anymore, you didn't mention something that many people consider a second Holocaust, intermarriage. So if you could address that, please.
Well, that's
We're going to hold off.
okay.
And you maybe write that down.
I'll drink water.
My friend here in the front row. Yes.
Okay, here's my question. The Jews seem to be centered on the right wing, but yet we have Islamic anti-Semitism. We talk about Charlottesville. We don't talk about kill the Jews, destroy Israel, get rid of Israel by the Muslims. And the Jews seem to center with the Muslims who want our destruction. What is your answer to this?
Okay, thank you. And she'll repeat. That question dealt with the presence of Muslim or Islamic anti-Semitism. And what does Professor Lipstadt think about that? And she'll elaborate on it. And the third question is the gentleman right there.
I was just going to ask that.
Oh,
you know,
well,
Israel's
there may not be a
mentioned-
need to repeat it.
Israel was mentioned, and the New Testament was mentioned, and Martin Luther. I was going to ask what any comments about Islam and anti-Semitism
So
for
since
the
that's-
present and future.
Since that's a
Until-
repetition, the last person, last row. Judah will come up to you.
You had mentioned earlier that you were against politicians coming in, at least now in today's world, and saying what is an idea that is good, what is hate, and things of that nature. My question to you is, Mein Kampf was banned in Germany as part of the end of World War II. It has now been allowed to publish again in Germany. And the question is, looking at things back in the 1940s, do you think you would have been for or against the publication of Mein Kampf in Germany after World War II?
Okay, so the 3 questions are intermarriage as a Holocaust, Muslim anti-Semitism, and the publication of Mein Kampf.
I'm not a sociologist, and it's really they who analyze more intermarriage. I wrote an article many years ago really decrying intermarriage and talking about it as something that seriously threatened the Jewish community. I still think in many cases it does, but I also know too many families where one partner is not Jewish, who are actively raising their kids as Jews, where they sending their kids to day school, which is a big commitment. The home is a Jewish home. I'm thinking of one couple in particular, where the husband says, I don't believe in any religion. I was born a Christian, yes, my family is Christian, but I don't believe in religion. For me to convert would be a sham. Yet he's sending his daughters to day school. He's proud as can be that his wife is active in the synagogue, active in the Jewish community, trying to revive a synagogue in Atlanta. So I think the jury is out. Would I prefer that the young people in my family marry Jews? Of course, because there's more of a guarantee of a continuation of the tradition. But I know many families where Jews are married to Jews and they could give two wits about Jewish tradition. So I think it's a more complicated picture than we thought. And I do think that the Jewish community it's been both depleted and been enriched in both ways. So I think it's a more variegated picture. In terms of Islamic anti-Semitism, I think when I was talking about the genocide of the Palestinians or the accusation of genocide of the Palestinians or the Hitler-like tactics of IDF, I was certainly referring to that. But I think we also have to be careful. We have to be careful about talking about the Muslims, the same way we have to be careful about talking about the Jews. Yes, there is a real problem, and it's been shown the EU did a study of anti-Semitism in Europe. It came out about a year ago. It's very interesting. And it talks about the fact that in many European countries where there is a substantial Muslim population, anti-Semitism is endemic. It's not like the kids are told go out and kill Jews or go burn down people if you beat up people if you see Israeli flag, but that it's almost the way in a white household in the South and outside the South as well. In the 20s, people might have talked about African Americans the way they talk about Jews. It's built into the culture that when they learn about the Holocaust in the school they go to, then the Jews were bad. Of course, they hated them. So it is very problematic. I see anti-Semitism coming from the right. I see anti-Semitism, as I said earlier, coming from the left. Comes from there are certainly Muslims who are anti-Semitic and many Muslims who are not. But it is built, it has worked its way into the Islamic world in a way that is disturbing. And the final question on Mein Kampf, what I would have done, I probably, first of all, who was it who said, foolish consistencies are the hobgoblins of small minds? I think Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, right? He said, foolish consistencies. I make no claim to being consistent. I saw no problem with Germany banning the publication of Mein Kampf. Legal reasons, it's now been reissued, annotated, etc. But there are many, I know a lot of scholars and academics in Germany who study anti-Semitism in Germany, and they said to some degree the banning of Mein Kampf made it forbidden fruit, made it more attractive. I came back from France, I bought back a copy of Mein Kampf. So it's a tricky kind of thing.
Context matters, time and space. Right. Okay, we're going to take one final batch of 3 questions. Yes, right there, the first. Let's see, in the middle there, and then finally behind you. So let's begin right there.
So my name is Michael Rand. I belong to the Jewish Center, and I mention that because it's their 100th year. They've been taking the weekly bullet or monthly bulletins and putting them out for people to see in the past, and a bunch of them have ads from your father's business.
Right.
So if you want to see, you can go in
Upper West Side. Right.
And my question is, the head of the Anti-Defamation League was on the Jewish TV channel, and he talked about what they're doing, et cetera.
Okay. Second question right there. Yes, please. Gentleman with a beard. Yeah. Maybe you can stand up so we can. Yeah.
I'm 30. I grew up in New York. I work in the entertainment industry, and my girlfriend's from California. She's around the same age. And when we saw the Charlottesville Jews Not Replace Us footage, we had this moment. We were both kind of like, we had never really seen anything like that in the present day. We've both been so sheltered from that. And it almost felt like this old-timey thing to us, like this idea of this kind of anti-Semitism felt dead in our bubble. What do you think people in our position need to understand about anti-Semitism that we might be sheltered from?
Whoa.
And finally, yes, please.
In a time when historical fact does not seem to carry the same weight that it did some time ago, do you think that will affect your position on having laws against anti-Semitism?
Laws against Holocaust denial, outline Holocaust denial. Okay. The online issue. I assume you're talking about Jonathan Greenblatt. And he's absolutely correct. The defense agencies, the organizations which follow and monitor anti-Semitism, were, to use a British term, gobsmacked, absolutely flabbergasted during the election as the anti-Semitism began to, online anti-Semitism began to appear. Wiseman, I think it's Joseph Wiseman, who is the one of the deputy editors of the New York Times, had written an article. It mainly came from the right, from Trump supporters, had written an article, and they began to troll him, to attack him online with the parentheses. They're called the echoes. It's usually 3, sometimes it's 2 parentheses. And when he got it, this was early in the campaign, he didn't know what it was. This was early on. And he wrote to the person who had sent it to him, and the person said, what about that Ashkenazi genius that you're supposed to have? It's belling the cat. You know the story of belling the cat, where the mice tie a bell around the cat's neck, so they'll always, when the cat is asleep, so when they'll know when the cat is coming, they'll know to scamper away. So we now see the echoes. Weissman and other journalists now put the echo. You don't have to guess that I'm a Jew. I'm telling you that I'm a Jew. Jeffrey Goldberg, editor of The Atlantic, talks about extensively the anti-Semitism which emerged online. Bethany Mandel, who writes for commentary, writes for the forwards, had briefly mentioned an article by, is it Robert Kagan? Robert Kagan, in which he, and this again is during the campaign, which he found parallels between fascism and some of the things were being said by Trump and by the Trump campaign. And they began to troll her so much, she wrote an article for this in the forwards, that she went out and bought a gun. They even doxed her, is what it's called, where they found out her personal information, her personal Facebook page, her personal address, and things like that. It is extensive, and it is active. It has given a new life to anti-Semites. Because before, certainly with Holocaust denial, there were countries that monitored using the mails for Holocaust denial, stopped the sending of this kind of stuff if they could track it. And the internet, it's a free-for-all, and it's very much there. What I say to my students about, I don't talk that much about it, but what I say generally, and what I said in the, and this really goes to a certain extent to the final question about fake news and things like that. So I'll take those 2 and then I'll come back to your question. Is that before you post something, before you share something, even if it agrees with what you believe, check it out. I recently, and I don't remember exactly what the circumstances were, but I was looking at something on Facebook, and they said something horrible, anti-Semitic, sexist, had been said by some politician, Republican, Trump supporter politician, neither of which I am, and I was about to repost it. It was just horrific. And then I stopped and I said, wait a minute. If this person really said that, I would be seeing it all over Facebook, certainly in my news feed, which of course, Facebook selects what you get, but they know that's the kind of stuff I look at. So I Googled the headline, and the only source that came up for it was the source that was on Facebook. So clearly it was fake news, and I didn't post it. I've made mistakes sometimes, but how important it is to check it out, how important it is to know the source. It's there. And if you are trolled, I mean, I don't read the comments when I post an article. I haven't read the comments on my TED Talk. I haven't read the comments in my Atlantic articles and other things. And, sometimes people will point me to a particularly vituperative comment or something like that. But it's I can't give you an exact answer of what to do. We're only beginning to fully understand the phenomenon. And the fake news, I think fake news is very dangerous. Even when it has nothing to do with Jews or anti-Semitism or Israel, fake news, when we begin to distrust, Jews have flourished in democratic countries. Countries which are really democratic, multicultural, we have flourished in a way that we've never flourished anyplace else, except maybe in our own state. And when you begin to attack the democratic institutions, the media, the courts, even the FBI, when you begin to create doubts about the reliability of what they all lie, it's all fake news, it's not a good thing for the nation at large, and it's not a good thing for the Jewish people. And I don't say that, yes, I have my own political bias, which is, of course, always hard to set aside. But I say that left and right. It's simply not a good thing. And, finally, I wish I had a really good answer for you and your girlfriend. That's a long-distance relationship. I wish you great good luck. You know red eyes well, huh? Oh, okay. I hope that's good for her. Better for you, certainly. I wish I had a good answer for you. I wish I had an easy answer for you. But to give you an easy answer would be to sort of denigrate the whole reason you're here tonight, that you picked this to start your series. This is something that, as much as I study it, I'm still surprised by it. I'm reminded, lahavdil, Rabbi Heschel, Abram Joshua Heschel's final interview on the early NBC morning, on religion, and he was asked, who was it who interviewed him? I forget who interviewed him, but he said, what still surprises you? And he said, everything. Even as much as I study it, as much as I understand it, I'm still surprised by it. When I was in high school, we studied the internal combustion engine, all the parts. Teacher took us to a garage shop, and we saw an engine being taken apart and how it works, and the pistons and all these things. And shortly thereafter, when I went to driver's ed in high school so we could all get our license, and I put the key in and turned it on, and it moved, I was surprised. And to some degree, I know all the moving parts of anti-Semitism. But how it's possible that, going back to my field of study of the Holocaust, that the nation that was considered, after you finished your PhD in the United States, you went to Germany to get a real education. It was considered the leading intellectual, creative, artistic place, designs a murder system which will go after a particular people. Like if they had won, they would have murdered many people. But this was a murder that could not wait. And not just in the boundaries of their country, but as far as they could across Europe. As I said earlier, going to Rhodes after the landing at Normandy, when they're on the defensive. The Soviet forces are moving west. It's clear that it's not good, the situation is not good for them. Hungary, the Jews in Hungary, in 7 weeks, Eichmann oversees the murder of over 400,000 Jews, and when he's told to stop by Himmler, he still sneaks through another trainload of Jews. I can't explain that. I can explain how it happened, what happened, but there's still something through all these years that beggars the imagination that I can't fully explain. So I can't tell you, explain it to you in a way that would really fully explicate it, because I can't do that myself. But what I can say, and maybe to go back to what I was saying earlier about Ravidovich, that as much as you're disturbed by it, and I'm glad you're disturbed by it, because we all should be disturbed by it, and not just say, oh, it was just whatever. It was frightening. And now the murder of a young man, a student at University of Pennsylvania in California, Blaise, Bernstein, now is being attributed to a right-wing neo-Nazi extremist. Those are horrific things, and things that should disturb us, and we should be active in talking about them and monitoring them. And when someone says, oh, anti-Semitism, you Jews talk about anti-Semitism, it's not real. Yes, it is real. But at the same time, and I know nothing about you or your now East Coast based girlfriend, but I would say that if you're interested in your and concerned about your Jewish identity, that at the same time that you monitor, fight, are aware of this anti-Semitism, that you never let it become the motivating factor in the kind of Jews you are, the kind of household you'll build together with her or someone else, the way you'll educate your children about being Jews. That never, that the whole world, yes, they should know someday that the whole world hates the Jews. But before they learn about the oys, they should know about the joys. Before they learn about all that has been done to Jews, they should know what Jews do. What we've given to the world, what we do, how we celebrate, our tradition, our history, that should be what drives you. And if you do that, I think you'll be in a good, tonight will have been worth it. Dayenu, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before we depart, I just want to make 3 brief observations. First, if your appetites were whetted, if you were stimulated and inspired by this evening, I encourage you to come to our next session in this series and all of the sessions in them, so that we together can explore the meaning of the past to the present. Second, I want to thank again Dina and Jonathan Leader for their generous support of tonight's program and the History Matters series. And third, I want to remind you, the Center for Jewish History is a world-class archive, it's a museum, and it's a cultural center. And the axis around which everything revolves is the belief that history matters. And if you share that belief, then I encourage you to join as a member of the Center for Jewish History, and even more ambitiously, to consider sponsoring a program such as this. I'd be happy to talk to you after tonight's session. And again, it's just been a great privilege to have Professor Deborah Lipstadt with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.